Good evening. Thank you for joining the Dole Institute of Politics for the program this evening. My name is Sierra Harkey, and I'm a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The SAB is a bipartisan group. As a member of the SAB, I get access to many great opportunities by being involved with the Institute. If you are a KU student and are interested in joining, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. For this evening's event, if you would like to know more about our guest, the event itself, upcoming Institute events, and more, you can download a printable program handout. The link is in the event description below. At the end of this evening's event, we will have time for you to ask questions of our guest. Please email your questions to dolequestions@ku.edu. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. And now, please join me in welcoming Director of the Institute, Bill Lacey.
Thank you very much, Sierra. That was a very nice introduction. We appreciate the tremendous student advisory board we have and all the hard work that they all do on behalf of the Dole Institute. Welcome everyone to tonight's program on the new documentary, Unrepresented. I think it's going to be a very interesting evening discussing what I think is a very important film. I want to first recognize our co-sponsors tonight, the Department of History and the Department of Political Science at the University of Kansas, as well as the KU Journalism School. We appreciate their support. We have three special guests tonight. We have Andrew Rodney, who's the writer and producer of the award-winning film Unrepresented. We have Mr. Greg Orman, leader of the independent candidacies groups and very involved in that, and he's been an independent candidate for both governor and Senate in the state of Kansas. And Mary Banwart, who's a good friend of the Dole Institute, is a professor of political communication studies, and director of the Institute for Leadership Studies at the University of Kansas. Everyone, welcome. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'll start with a question directed right at Andrew, who is responsible for this important documentary. Andrew, let's start by asking you to explain why you made the documentary and what issues and individuals you selected to feature in the documentary.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks to the Dole Institute for making this possible. I made this documentary. I started making documentaries just out of desire to see some change, and I think I got more involved in causes, and I found myself in getting involved in various causes, finding that people didn't have enough awareness of the history and the causes of problems that we were trying to address. So the director of this film and I, who was a close friend of mine growing up, made the first film about a modern history of Detroit City, which is where we're from, and the problems that our city was facing and had faced over the last 50 years and their causes. And that film and my experience in Detroit in making that film and after led me to conclude that many of the problems that Detroit was dealing with were as a result of federal policy that was unaccountable, unbalanced, that just didn't really make sense and didn't match what I think America's values are. And so I got more involved after making that film in causes trying to address Congress's problems. And in doing so, after a while of being involved in these causes, I found that there was, again, enough people who really didn't have a rounded, nonpartisan understanding of the issues, and that it would be beneficial to make an educational film that would help people to understand, especially from this nonpartisan perspective, what it is that's really enabling our Congress to be so unaccountable, unrepresentative, and that's what led us to make the film. And the reason that we selected the interviewees that we did were largely just as a result of people that we met while working, myself in these movements before making the film, and while we were making the film, just the research that we did and who was already writing about this, people like Greg, well, he's not in the film, but people who have just been active over the years in trying to promote the solutions to the problems that we're seeing. So some people were just historians that had been writing about this stuff for a while, like a Mike Lofgren, and others are people who are actively involved. After making our first film, which focused on the history of Detroit's challenges, we realized how important it is that you always deliver a hopeful message and put the spotlight on the people that are working on the solutions. If without that, it just feels hopeless, but there's always hope. So hope that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely. Andrew, for those who are watching tonight who didn't pre-screen the film, or those who are going to watch on replay later this week or next week, when will the film be debuting on PBS?
It's debuting on PBS right now in different areas of the country. So there's different air dates. If you go to our website, there is a way to see when it will be airing in Kansas. I believe it'll be different stations are playing it at different times. There's several different PBS stations in Kansas. So the best way is to go to weareunrepresented.com and look for a link there that will show you the screening dates and times.
Great, thank you. I want to bring Greg and Mary into the discussion. I'm not going to pose the question specifically to any of you, but whoever would like to answer, all three of you like to answer. Let's start with this one. Why has money gotten so important in politics?
Well, I think there are really two answers to that question. One is money has historically been the way you get reelected. And so, candidates who are able to raise lots of money ultimately are much more successful electorally. And because the goal of many people running for political office is to win, and then when they win, the goal is to get reelected, money takes an outsized importance in the political process. In fact, I think you go all the way back to the former Speaker of the House of California 45 years ago, and he referred to money as the mother's milk of politics, and there's no question that that's the case. The second reason it's important is just because the federal budget is so large, and this is an issue that I think Andrew tied together for people that I think is missing in a lot of the critiques of our current system, which is with a budget that, in normal times, we can exclude the pandemic spending, but in normal times now exceeds $4 trillion. There is a lot at stake. A significant part of our economy is tied up in federal spending. And so companies who invest in influencing policy are getting an incredibly large return on their investment. As a very simple example, the pharmaceutical industry spends about $300 million a year lobbying in Washington, D.C. To put that into context, that's more than $500,000 for every congressperson or senator that they're paid to lobby. And it's estimated that the impact of prohibiting Medicare from negotiating prescription drug prices will cost our country over $500 billion over the next 10 years. So if you think about it, $300 million a year is a small price to pay in order to protect that almost $500 billion benefit that the pharmaceutical industry gets.
And I would jump in and add, I'll just jump in quick and say, I think that the one additional layer that the documentary really surfaces is that it's not just about the overt presence of money in politics, thinking about elections here, but it's the covert presence of it. So the overt part of it, right? It's what we report on our finance reports. It's the public version of the money that we know that it takes to get elected. But then, as the documentary explains, it's the money that flows once you're elected and then after you decide to step out of office. And there's a lot at play, and there's a lot to lose. There's a lot to win. And people have a lot of incentives, many of which the voters understand. It takes money to run an ad campaign. If you have more money, you can get your message out. That's understandable. I think what we don't understand is the sort of what happens behind the closed doors, and the documentary really spells that out. The one other thing that I would add that I hope we get a chance to talk about is the way that this money in politics both advantages and disadvantages, and we see how that plays out in the way in which our legislatures and our congressional caucuses are comprised. Who shows up, who's able to get elected, who's given the money and why, and that is very, very important to this conversation moving forward.
Yeah, I agree. And just to echo what Greg said, that this last election cycle, there was a lot of, as there is always, talk about the growing cost of the election. And I believe that the published figure is somewhere over $14 billion, and that's less than 0.1% of what will be spent in the year on just the federal budget. Maybe it's a little less than 0.2%. I might have that a little bit off, but with the stakes have been rising, the budget's been rising so much that the amount that people are spending on influencing is to some extent an outgrowth of that. And money's always been important in politics from the beginning, and it's just been growing, not only because of the federal budget, but there's some great books out there on lobbying, in particular, not just campaign spending, that will kind of show you how a lot of the spending on influencing campaigns and the government has tracked with has gone as the more involved the government has gotten into business and regulation, the more that businesses have realized that opening up a lobbying shop in DC is a very affordable way to increase your profits, get what you want from the 50s, but really the growth I think started in the 70s. The exponential growth kind of started in the 70s and has just proceeded since then.
Well, you just referenced this, Andrew, but I wanted to ask everyone, because this is an important point made in Unrepresented. Why do so many former members of Congress become lobbyists?
Well, I make a comment, and this is my criticism of many of the elected officials we have in Washington, D.C., is that it's not public service if it's the best job you're ever going to have. By definition, it's self-service. But for many folks in Washington, D.C., lobbying is actually the best job they're ever going to have, because there are many lobbyists who end up making seven-figure salaries, and ultimately with that other perks and privileges. And so I think if you're someone who's spent a decade or more in Washington, or you're a high-level congressional staffer, the move to lobbying is one of the most lucrative decisions you can make financially. It's one of the reasons I'm actually critical of much of H.R. 1, because it doesn't really address those incentives within Washington, D.C. I believe if we really genuinely want to get money out of politics, to sort of talk a little bit about what the professor said, we really need, among other things, to institute a lifetime ban on lobbying for members of Congress and their senior staffs. Ultimately, that will change fundamentally their incentives, not only why they want to get elected in the first place, but how they behave when they are elected. Because I think it's naive to assume that when somebody is considering legislation that may affect their future lobbying prospects, that they don't take that into consideration, if not consciously, subconsciously, when voting. And so I think, again, The reason so many people do it is because it's so lucrative. And if we really care about fixing Washington, we should ban the practice entirely.
Yeah, I found the examples of Newt Gingrich and Tom Daschle to illustrate, this answer your question well. They were both in high leadership positions while they were in Congress. And when they left, they didn't leave Washington. They merely opened up shops and were making millions of dollars annually to lobby. So I mean, that's why you get into lobbying. I know many people who have worked in high office and then turned around and made double, triple what they were earning while in office by merely entering what you could call lobbying. Lobbying, it can be tough to define. Is helping somebody to get an appointment lobbying, or is that just a connection? But regardless, it pays very well. So that's why members of Congress, 30-40% of them are going to enter lobbying when they're done.
And I would just add there too, Bill, real quickly, that one of the things that we know is that at least in the 2018 congressional cycle, the election cycle, there are more white male candidates received PAC money than did female candidates and/or candidates of color. And so one of the things that we see is a perpetuating cycle there as well. So not only the individual gain when you're out of office, but then it continues to feed a network that looks a lot like, acts a lot like, and thinks a lot like the current network in power. So in essence, it just continues to perpetuate itself.
Let me ask the three of you, why has Congress gotten so bad about passing budgets?
Well, budget votes are tough votes to take. Ultimately, if you go through normal order and you do a budget and there are lots of amendments, the leaders are looking to protect their members from having to take difficult votes. And the budget process is one of the areas where they look to protect them. I mean, who wants to be out there? Too many votes supporting any particular thing that might benefit you parochially but doesn't benefit broadly, or vice versa. And so I just think, again, it's a function of Washington, D.C. being far more interested in getting their people reelected than they are in solving problems for the American people. And the net result is, to them, the idea of sacrifice is flying in coach class and not first class. And the idea of courage is not, sort of rushing into battle and getting shot at with bullets. It's maybe having to take a difficult vote that you have to come home and explain. And they work really hard to prevent their members from having to take those difficult votes.
And it's pretty hard to explain those in a 30-second ad, because what's going to show up in that ad is all the reasons why that member of Congress shouldn't have taken that vote. And so obviously, if you're going to respond, you've got to figure out, how am I going to explain all the reasons why I did? And that's tough to do in 30 seconds. And that's, a lot of our campaigns anymore consist of a 30-second soundbite.
I would also, Bill, I'd like to go back to one other thing as I was thinking about the lobbying comment, and just as evidence that lobbying is so lucrative. Right now, the 5 wealthiest counties in America all touch Washington, D.C. And this is the first time in history. I think 2019 was the first time that was the case. But if it's any indication of how lucrative the business of Washington, D.C. is, I think you need no more evidence than looking at that.
Okay, the federal debt is actually now getting close to $30 trillion. What role has this problem with, with lobbyists and with not wanting to vote for controversial budgets? How has all that played into the deficit that we have today as a country?
Well, it's just
Well,
easier
again,
to spend. I'm sorry, Greg, but yeah, it's just easier. And it always will be easier to just create money than it will be to raise it through taxes. So I feel that as long as that option is on the table, and there are statutory limits that are supposed to prevent this from happening, but that's the one thing that a majority of Congress can agree on in a bipartisan basis is to extend, increase the debt ceiling, and allow for this to continue, because it's just so much easier to do. And the degree of lobbyists, I mean, it's all one big breakdown, and that's what we try and show in the film. That is all one big problem that we've outsourced government, as Mike Lofgren says in the film, but people have claimed that we're trying to shrink government, but all that they're doing is just outsourcing it to contractors, who then turn around and give political contributions. These lobbyists just feed into the system, and then this debt, I feel, is kind of the grease that allows it to go. We say it in the film. We talk about campaign finance and lobbying as that's influence buying. That's how you buy influence. But what assures that the payoff happens is that debt is there. That national debt is there to assure that the interest that you are trying to protect or trying to extend the gain of will be able to get it, because they won't have to fight with another interest group that is pushing for their benefit. So long as they're there in Washington, D.C., so long as they have lobbyists representing their interests, so long as they're spending the money on campaigns to open the door, then they're going to be protected, because with no requirement that you balance that budget on any time frame, then there's no requirement to take that hard vote. You don't have to agree to cut the Marines Air Force. The Marine Air Force, it costs $10 billion a year. They're a member of the Navy that has the Air Force, has an Air Force, and then there is the Air Force. And the Bill Owens, who's pictured in the film, Admiral Bill Owens, he said that there's no reason for the Marines to have an Air Force, but if you were to try and cut that, then you're going to have a bunch of pissed off Marines, against you. And why would you ever do that? And I saw the same thing in Detroit, where we had the war on drugs, has led to just massive homicide, greater than 20,000 murders in the city of Detroit since 1969. It doesn't make sense in the way that it's being prosecuted, but it continues today. And the reason it does is because there's special interests there that are promoting it. It doesn't make economic sense. It doesn't make rational sense. So they are just they piggyback on themselves. And I think that the national debt is kind of is the great enabler that we have to address.
Yeah, I always say that true public service requires courage, and public service without courage quickly becomes self-service. And I think, as the documentary, I think, effectively pointed out, we've got a lot of folks in Washington, D.C. who are in the business of serving themselves. And one of the ways they do that is by not tackling the difficult issues that we have to attack as a nation. And the rising national debt is just a byproduct of that. I remember being 18 years old, being in Washington, D.C., as a part of a group of youth governors, and meeting at the time with the Federal Reserve Governor, Wayne Angell, who was a good Kansan. And I raised the question about the national debt at that time, in probably 1987. And he responded by saying, well, you shouldn't really have to worry about it. It's not nearly at the levels it was as a percent of our economy after World War II. And at the time, I was sort of surprised by that answer, because I thought, are we really comparing where we are right now in a period of relative peacetime to a period of time where we basically mobilized 16 million American soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, ultimately had roughly half of all industrial production going to the war effort? It didn't seem like an appropriate comparison. But fast forward to today, and our debt levels as a percentage of the economy are now higher than they were at a period of time when we were fighting totalitarianism in Northern Africa, in Europe, in Asia. And it's just, it's indefensible that during this period of time of relative peace, that we should run up the kinds of debts that we do. The reason we don't attack those issues, though, is because there are significant entrenched interests who are willing to spend money to defeat the representatives and senators who have the courage to address those issues. And, if you look at it, the people who are really paying for this, it's not just the national debt, but it's the average American. When Donald Trump was elected, 2016, median household income in America hadn't risen in 17 years. Think about that for a second. The period of time that it takes a child to go from being born to entering their senior year in high school, that's how long it had been since the average American household had seen a pay increase. At the same time, the things they spend so much money on, healthcare, childcare, higher education, have so far outstripped the rate of inflation that for the average American family, it didn't feel like you were treading water. It felt like you were drowning. And so when people ask me, gee, you've got a lot of folks who voted for Trump in Kansas, how do you talk to those people? I tell them I get it. I understand their desire for something different. I understand that this system of government is leaving them behind because Washington, D.C. is unwilling to tackle the hard issues that will ultimately improve their lives. And so I think, again, the national debt is just a byproduct of a group of people in Washington more interested in their own political futures than they are in the economic present and future of the American people.
And I would add, Bill, I think it really is a tough sell for a politician to turn around and say, the last several decades, we have run up the deficit at extraordinary numbers, but now you're going to have to pay higher taxes for that. You're going to have to pay higher taxes for really bad decisions and other people's benefits. Really a tough sell during a campaign election cycle. And I think the film talks about and breaks down really well this role of tax breaks, especially for large corporations. And I realize that can be a quick blame, right? Tax breaks for the rich or tax breaks for the corporations bad. But the film actually kind of unpacks the fact that maybe sometimes those tax breaks, we could argue, are good and well-meaning, but we don't have a good way of tracking those. So in many instances, kind of into perpetuity, there are a lot of folks who are benefiting from the economy. They're benefiting from, the way that we do business here in America, but they're not paying back in their fair share. And so, yes, to go back to rural Kansas, for instance, and say, I'm going to have to vote for raising taxes for you, it's just tough to stomach. We have to do better, and we have to find ways to make sure that Congress holds the individuals accountable who benefit from the policies that they pass.
And I think the professor raises a great point too, which is so much of spending that happens in Washington doesn't happen through the bright light of the budgeting process, or it doesn't even show up in a budget. It shows up in the darkness of the tax code. And that's definitely an issue that needs to be addressed. There's an old saying that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And there's no question as it relates to our tax code, we need a healthy dose of sunlight.
Well, Senator Bob Dole was known as a deficit hawk and would probably consider one of his greatest regrets in the Senate not getting a balanced budget through in 1996. Given that neither party seems to be committed to balancing the budget, what's the path forward?
This is an interesting question. Go ahead, Andrew.
No. Please.
Okay, this is an interesting question because it's something, it's a conversation that I've been having a lot lately, because right now, we've gone through an unprecedented period of both fiscal and monetary stimulus, and we still have, in a historical sense, relatively low interest rates. And, the theory has always been that at some day there will be a point of reckoning, And that point of reckoning will bring with it significant inflation, an inability of the US government to raise money at reasonable interest rates, and ultimately the ensuing debt and interest burden will end up crowding out spending on all sorts of things that we really genuinely need to spend money on. The issue is, as long as folks, deficit hawks like Senator Dole have been saying that, you can go back to the Concord Coalition, Warren Rudman, et cetera. It's been decades that people have been warning about this. It still hasn't come home to roost. And so, ultimately, I think Washington tends to act best when there's a crisis. And unfortunately, we may have to get ourselves to a point of crisis before the two parties that we have there right now are willing to give up any sort of electoral advantage to address this issue.
I say that that is completely correct, and but when things will change is when there's just the mass psychology changes, when people recognize that we're in a crisis. Because if you look at the average American who is facing homes that they can't afford, the rising cost of education, healthcare, that they can't afford and have been, we're in this interesting kind of feedback loop where there's all this money that's going out to and I'll just say special interest. It doesn't fully address it, but the special interests, very wealthy people, and then they contribute that money back into the political process, and a lot of that money goes into communications, and so the people are getting these messages that are so manufactured, and the reason for them is to protect the interests of the people that are spending that money, and they're getting this completely unclear message as to how to deal with these problems. So I'd say that so many people are already in a crisis. The crisis is going to have to get bigger until it's addressed. But we're at a crisis point, but people don't recognize it because the way that the way that our political system is working, the way all the money that's coming back in and influencing campaigns, all the money that's being spent on communications is convincing people that the divide is between, right and left. It's about, whatever the topic of controversy of the day is. And you have to fight about COVID or in the response to that, it's your personal identity. It's all these different things that distract from the real issue. So I don't know what the crisis point will be, but how we get back to sanity is by trying to make it to deal with all this partisan noise, I feel. And when I started the film, it was a lot more focused on the budgetary issue, the deficit issue. But I found in making it that people were so polarized that they couldn't even have a conversation rationally about, debt and the impacts that it had, because, they perceived that as strictly partisan. They couldn't hear about the problems that it caused. So we made the film. We had to make the film in a way that was more broad-based. We had to cover the corruption cycle because people aren't they're so polarized at this point. So I think addressing that's what we're trying to do with the film, and I think that's the first step is what can we do to depolarize, make the political process less partisan. And yes, a crisis is going to help us to deal. A greater crisis is going to help us to deal with that. But I think we're already there in some points. We're watching this huge run up in prices right now, and housing prices are at their levels not before since 2006, or the increases. I think we're just about there. But I'm scared about what the result could be when people are as divided as they are.
Yeah, we have to start to look at collaboration and working across the aisle as something that's positive, and that's when the real work gets done. And if you look at a lot of the political science data, that's when the bills that we really care about are passed. It's not when there's partisan divide and rancor on one side or the other, where only special interest issues finally ultimately see the light of day. We have to also work hard to help people understand that they can understand politics, and it's not so sophisticated, it's not so complicated. People can make it that way. The special interest groups can definitely make it that way, but it's not. And we need everyone's voice to be heard. Everyone has a right and a role to be involved in politics, and we have to increase the diversity of those who hold office. The longer that politics looks a certain way, the more likely we are to see people say opt out and say, that doesn't look like a group of people who look like me and talk about the issues that I care about and my community cares about. And so therefore, I'm not going to participate. We have to shift that line of reasoning, and we have to help people understand that we've got to move new people in. We've got to move folks in who are willing to work across the aisle, who are willing to cooperate, who are willing to make some tough decisions, and who look more representative of the population and therefore can effectively represent their constituents.
There's a Dartmouth professor named Charlie Whelan who has a good metaphor for that. He says we can't think about politics the same way we think about a bad restaurant. Not going isn't going to make politics any better the same way it might have that bad restaurant go out of business and a better restaurant come in its place. In fact, just the opposite. If you don't participate in politics, the old adage goes, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And the groups that aren't participating in politics are the ones that are ultimately getting hurt the most from the decisions that are getting made. So I agree with that wholeheartedly. Andrew made a comment about feedback loops, and it's interesting. This is the one critique that I gave Andrew of the film, is to say, I wish we connected more to the implications to everyday Americans of this cycle of corruption. I wish we talked about the roughly 40% of Americans who can't afford a prescription drug because they're priced out of the market, or the 1 in 4 cancer patients who skip a chemotherapy treatment because they can't afford it. I wished we talked a little bit more about the impact of rising healthcare costs because of all the money that the industry spends to protect all of the benefits they have in our current system, but the impact of rising healthcare costs on our ability to raise wages. I own a bunch of small businesses. Every year we try to give our employees raises. Every year the question I have to answer first is, how much more do I have to pay for their healthcare? We've got families of 4 under some of our plans where the healthcare costs are going up 10 to 20% a year and have been consistently, and now make up over a third of the dollars that we spend on those folks. And so invariably, I wish that the documentary would have done more to link to the real pain and issues associated with this cycle of corruption that we're seeing in Washington.
And we tried to touch on that. I think in the healthcare section, we did talk about, medical bankruptcies, but no, the personal stories of people who have to make these trade-offs, the people that are, I think the statistic in the film was that 70+% of personal bankruptcies are caused by medical bills. It's touched on, but yes, I agree. There's, we could have done better, and I welcome,
just to clarify my comments, I love the film. So I thought that Andrew and his fellow filmmakers did a terrific job of explaining an issue and really connecting the cycle of corruption in Washington, D.C. more effectively than I've seen it done anywhere else. And I recognize the limitations of having to have a program that fits into an hour-long programming window. As someone who's debated in political debates and, then been, read articles about it, about how I didn't go into enough detail about my economic development plans. And I think to myself, well, I got 45 seconds on the stage. How much detail do you expect to go into? You've got the same limitations when you're making a film like this. So if people haven't seen the film, I would wholeheartedly recommend it as a really good window into what's happening in Washington, D.C. And how it's affecting us as a nation.
And I would absolutely agree with that as somebody who spent 20 years working there. I think it's an excellent job that Andrew and his team did, and would recommend it to everyone. We focus largely tonight on the problems, but what are some of the solutions to these problems? It's great to talk about trying to get the polarization out of politics, but what can we actually do? What should citizens be attempting to do?
Well, so much of the problem with reforming the system is that in some senses it requires the consent of the victims. So as I've talked about HR 1, I think HR 1 would have been a much more powerful and palatable bill to the American people if they would have come out and said a lifetime ban on lobbying for members of Congress and senior administration officials, if they would come out and said, Congress will not raise money while Congress is in session, while we're up there in Washington, D.C., getting paid $170,000+ a year. We're there to do your job, not to work for our reelection. If they would have ended leadership PACs, ended the ability of lobbyists to raise money for political campaigns, to pull together PACs and hold fundraisers, et cetera. If they would have done those reforms, I would have been the biggest cheerleader for HR 1. But the reality is those are tough reforms that require the consent of the victims. Where people can get involved is by changing some of the electoral incentives that affect our ability to compromise, affect elected leaders' ability to compromise. So if you look as an example, Alaska recently passed an electoral innovation which coupled a top 4 open primary. So they eliminated partisan primaries altogether, and it was a top 4 open primary with a ranked choice voting general election. I think we've already seen the impact of that electoral reform in that Lisa Murkowski was one of the Republicans who was actually willing to buck her party in the impeachment trial. And I think she was able to do that in large part because she knew when she ran for re-election in 2022, she didn't have to run through a Republican primary anymore. And so I think there are electoral reforms that organizations like Unite America, and Nick Troiano, the executive director of Unite America, who was featured in the film, are advocating for. There's an Institute for Political Innovation that is really taking a leadership role in getting reforms like that done in 8 more states in 2022. And if you just think of the implications of that, if 10 to 12 US senators were elected knowing that they didn't have to go through a partisan primary the next time they were up for re-election, you could build a real fulcrum in the United States Senate of senators who could actually do what's in the best interests of all their constituents, not just the activists and the extremists who dominate partisan primaries.
I would say 3 things. Number 1, don't hesitate to run for office. We started just in this past year, we joined with United We to start a program that helps train women in Kansas to sit on civic boards and commissions and run for political office. Nonpartisan. We want to see more women on both sides of the aisle in office because we know that among countries, for instance, the implications are even global. Among countries that elect more women to office, they see greater economic growth during those electoral terms. We know that more women in office means more legislation gets passed, and there's more collaboration and work across the aisle. And that's particularly true when we have Republican women in office as well. So not just on one side of the aisle or the other, it's on both sides of the aisle. Number 2, vote. We have to vote. Excuse me, we have to vote, and we have to not be afraid to participate in the political process. This impacts our daily life. We've already talked about it so far tonight, just how crucial it is to know about the votes that are passed, the implications of the votes that are passed, and the ways in which we can affect the process and participate in the process. And number 3, have conversations. That may be the easiest thing to do, but socialization research tells us that when parents will have conversations with their children about politics and what's happening on the news, in elections, etc., both boys and girls will show a greater interest through school and then longer through their adult life in politics in the process than if there wasn't conversation at home. And that is particularly true for girls. Mothers end up being their greatest political role model, and they're more likely to be involved and say that they can still run when they're in college than girls who don't have those conversations with parents at home. So 3 things you can do, and one of the most simple things you can do is have a conversation, and that will change the dynamic alone.
I agree with both of you, and I think that I would say that look at your state and local level in terms of running or supporting people that are running first. You know, Greg talked about great reforms that can happen, and they can happen at the state level, and that's more likely to lead to the kind of change that we're talking about. Is measures that are going to pass at the state level to change the electoral process. So, you know, there's every cycle, there is so much money that is being spent telling us that it's life or death, again, on who you vote for Congress, Senate, you know, the presidency, that these are the decisions that you have to, you know, divide yourself around, and they're make or break, and they are very serious. But you have enormous and greater power at the state and local level to influence real transformational policy. Your state representative is a whole lot more like you than your congressional representative. They have a lot less interest groups that are bearing down on them. You have to learn. You have to get knowledgeable about the policies. We featured some great groups like Unite America in the film. There's a lot of great groups. There's Independent Voters Project. I'm a big supporter of, and if you go to the Bridge Alliance website, Bridge Alliance is a group that coordinates or they help to kind of promote a lot of more nonpartisan movements for a variety of causes that you can find, and you can find one that suits you and see if there's an opportunity in your state to get involved. So I would say look at the state and local level and how you can get involved there. And then I would say from that, you do have to, one thing that I wish we had time in the film to get deeper into was the degree to which all of the spending that is happening on politics is polarizing media, and the way that, you know, ways that we don't see it, that this spending is influencing the message that we are hearing, whether it's through Facebook or cable news or, you know, even official news sources. There is you know, a lot. There's such an overwhelming push to kind of spin the story, and you have to become knowledgeable about how that happens. I know that, Mary, you're very experienced and knowledgeable in that area, but we have to become more knowledgeable about that, because we don't know when we're hearing a message. We don't. It's very carefully designed many messages are very carefully designed to make us feel a certain way and about politics and how we should act. And we have to kind of depolarize ourselves. And when we get these messages, we have to be able to understand that and have those conversations that Mary says with people, be able to talk to your cousins and your family without, you know, wanting to skip Thanksgiving dinner because, you know, somebody's going to espouse some crazy view. And I think those two, you know, smaller, you know, staying at the local level, understanding how things impact you and how they impact other people, understanding how political communications kind of work a little bit better, are both very important. And I agree with Greg that the area, as much as the film might deal with big congressional issues, the area that you should focus on is what you can do at your local level to make the election process more likely to produce a representative that is going to be less likely to be influenced by all of this, by spending, by the partisanship, by the parties, that want to make it easier for their candidates to take, easy votes and to, kind of corrupt the process a bit. So that's what I would say.
I have one more question tonight, but I would encourage members of the audience, if you have a question for our panelists, please send those to dolequestions@ku.edu. All of you have talked about the importance of voting and other things that can be done to try to correct the problems that we've discussed tonight. But if you were addressing an individual activist, what would you say to that person that they should do in terms of 2 or 3 things other than voting that might make a difference?
I'd encourage them to get involved with an organization like Unite America or an organization like the Institute for Political Innovation. And ultimately, I think the problems that we need to solve as a nation are very, very difficult to solve under the system that we have today and the incentives that are set up today. And so I just encourage, if an activist wants to spend their time and provide their leadership and hard work to help advance a cause that will ultimately have an impact, in my mind, it's very much focused on electoral reform, and the best way to do that would be through one of the organizations that's out there working hard on those issues today.
I think as well, volunteer. So yes, get involved in an organization that is advocating for issues that really connect with your values and your ideals, absolutely. But also volunteer for campaigns for candidates who are also representing those issues and your ideals. Campaigns never can have enough volunteers, and that's an important step in understanding the process better, acquainting yourself with the ins and outs of the issues, and also just politics in general. So absolutely volunteer for campaigns. And then I would say just consume as much media as possible to figure out, well, make yourself, as we've talked, make yourself as informed as possible. And then don't hesitate to reach out to current legislators and congressional officials. Make sure your voice is heard and that you don't hesitate to communicate with them actively and on a very regular basis. We know that constituent services should be an important part, and we need to make it more of an important part of when a politician serves. So hold them to that and let them know what your thoughts are, and don't hesitate to speak your mind and have a voice.
And I would just say that people really need to get out of their bubble. Unite America, independent voters are great for people who are more partisanly aligned. That's a good thing that they could do. But in general, just get out there and really spend time with people that have a different perspective than yours, and try not to be offended. I mean, just try and listen to what people have to say. I feel that we're increasingly angry at each other for having differing views and not realizing that it's a result of where we came from, where we grew up, what we've been exposed to over our lives. And the more time that you spend, listening to people with differing perspectives, the more you understand that what you have in common, and that might help you to see that the system that's kind of at work that is encouraging us to have these differences. The divide. I feel like there's so many PBS did a great series right after Trump was elected on how divided America was. But I feel that when you look at the people and the people that you know, the people that you'll meet, there's just incredible commonalities, and there's just wonderful values, and that Americans are such a strong group of people that have so much in common. And our political system is weakening us, and it's doing it intentionally because that makes it easier for weak people to get and hold power. And you have to. So I would encourage somebody who's being active to regardless of politics, to spend time and volunteer your time to causes that not the ones that you don't like necessarily, but ones that expose you to an independent voice, to conservative voices. Don't be so polarized, and spend more time involved with people that are differently you, because that's ultimately what's going to make you more effective. Our political system would like you to be polarized because it makes you easy to use, and you can be relied on to go one way or the other, and you have to be more independent to be to make change.
I'll actually, just to build on that just a little bit, as someone who ran as an independent, I sort of have a unique perspective of being in hundreds of rooms with people with varying political beliefs. And in fact, if you think about it, when a Democrat campaigns or a Republican campaigns, if they do a town hall, it's generally all Democrats or all Republicans who are at that town hall. Campaigning as an independent, you can have very liberal people and very conservative people in the same room. And going through that process and just sort of using it as an opportunity to lead a discussion among them, it becomes very clear that if you can get them to listen to each other, and if we as people can seek out understanding as our goal, not winning an argument as our goal, there is a lot of commonality and even common ground on many of our most contentious issues. But that's not what we get exposed to through campaigning and through the media. Campaigning, you don't get elected by saying my opponent's a reasonable person, we just have differing views on a few things. You get elected by painting them as the worst possible version of themselves, whether or not it's tethered to the truth. And the media is playing to partisan audiences as well. And so you really don't get that in our political culture unless you do as Andrew said, and that is get out of your bubble, talk to people who may have different political perspectives than you do, but do it from a frame of reference of trying to understand, not trying to win an argument. And if you can walk into those discussions with that frame of reference, I think you might fully appreciate how much more you genuinely have in common. And this idea that we are separated by left and right that Andrew touched on earlier, we did a lot of polling. Actually, Bill will remember the name Pat Cadell. Pat is a good friend of mine who passed away recently, but Pat had been doing a series of polls on voter alienation over the last 2 decades. And I, in fact, picked up his polling work last year when he passed away. And it's clear that the real divide is not between left and right, conservative and liberal. The real divide is between the political elite and everybody else. 85% of Americans believe Washington is a rigged game that only benefits those people who can buy access to power. And by all evidence, they're right. And that's why one of the reasons campaigning has become so divisive. It also is divisive because we are in a two-party world. If you think about it, Democratic and Republican brands are the 2 worst consumer brands in the world because they're defined exclusively by negative advertising. If Coke and Pepsi did that, Coke said Pepsi made you 3 inches shorter. Pepsi said Coke makes your hair fall out. Nobody would drink Coke and Pepsi. We'd drink water, beer, wine, anything other than those 2 products. The reason negative campaigning works so effectively is because we have a 2-party system where politics is viewed as a zero-sum game. If you had a credible third force in our politics, that wouldn't happen, which is frankly where I'm spending most of my time, is on working to de-rig the system, eliminate obstacles so that we really can create a credible third force, and in the process change our political culture and hopefully start solving problems again.
I'd like to turn to audience questions if I can now. Our first question is from Gabriel, who I believe it's the Gabriel who's a member of our student advisory board. Gabriel asked, typically when we think of corruption within a state, we can turn to states with weak institutions where you can pay to get your way. Would you consider lobbying corruption? And if so, what would be a good way to decrease lobbying incentives over time?
Yes, I mean, corruption there's many forms of corruption, but certainly, a lobbyist who spends their time bundling contributions to give to a candidate so that they get a hearing with them and ultimately get a say on the legislation that congressperson is offering and presenting is corruption, as we see in any country in the world. And how we can change that incentive, as Greg mentioned, you could try and ban members from becoming lobbyists. That would be an incentive. I think that I believe that this is universally almost agreed upon by anybody who's not a political elite. But stopping members of Congress from fundraising while they're in session is just common sense. I hate that a small provision like that gets bundled into a big bill with tons of provision like HR 1, because I think that the majority of Americans approve it and would just love to see which members of Congress don't approve something like that if it were just passed as an individual act. There's a number of measures like those that can be passed. I think those are two good ones: stopping somebody from being able to be a lobbyist, and again, stopping members of Congress from raising while in session. And then there's just too many. The PACs that are out there and the ways that you can bundle contributions there's just too much. I mean, why should a leadership PAC be able to raise more than an individual PAC? And why should those PACs exist in the first place? Why aren't citizens just donating directly to a candidate? Why are all these entities that exist in between the individual and the campaign or the person that they want to elect? Why do all these things exist? They exist because that was the way that Congress set it up, because that's the way they wanted to see it. But doesn't it make sense that individuals should just be contributing directly to campaigns? So things that improve disclosure in those areas, that eliminate the PACs that exist, especially super PACs, especially being able to pass contributions through corporations and other just shells to get to a campaign. Anything that you can do in that regard, I think, is an improvement on what we have now, and will help to unrig the system.
Yeah, I would agree that lobbying can be a productive exercise if it's in service of helping to educate congresspeople and their staffs about industries and the issues faced by those industries. So if it's really truly an expression of someone's First Amendment rights, that's one thing. Where it becomes corrupt is when it's coupled with fundraising for campaigns, and ultimately we've seen examples of that in the past. There's a relatively well-known example of John Boehner, at the time, I believe, still the Speaker of the House. Maybe it was prior to his ascendancy to Speaker. But handing out checks from the oil and gas industry on the floor of the House of Representatives before voting on a measure related to the oil and gas industry. I think we as people need to send an unmistakable message that our government is not for sale. And I agree with Andrew. Part of the challenge we have is these great big omnibus bills. HR 1, as an example, is almost 900 pages. And it's easy to sort of hide something in there or ultimately kill something and say, well, look, I voted for this, but the members on the other side didn't, because it's coupled with all sorts of other things that the members on the other side can say, well, I like that provision, but I voted against the bill because I didn't like the following provisions. It would be a whole lot cleaner if there were a real up and down vote on that. But I don't think we're going to see that. I don't think leadership is going to put their members in that position. And in many cases, they don't want the changes either. They just want the perception that they're working for those changes. It's the political theater that we see practiced in such an astute way in Washington, D.C. And so I think again, those provisions that require the consent of the victims are going to be awfully hard to get passed. But I do agree that they would be warranted and a great step forward.
And I would say too, certainly the power structure in place has a lot to lose if change happens. But one of the places that it seems like we really are going to have to look at change, and the documentary talks about this, is the way that campaigns are financed. Double checking these numbers, in 2018, 7 million small donors, and those are donors that are classified as giving under $200, 7 million small donors combined still did not give as much as the 3,500 largest donors. So if we start to look at sort of a public financing that really brings the public to the table and doesn't leave campaign finance in the hands of PACs and large corporations, then what the data tells us is that we're going to see a greater diversity of candidates, and we're going to see greater representation of constituents, and more people involved in the process. And it seems like if we get back to that sunshine that Greg talked about earlier, we're going to have more people involved demanding the sunshine before we start to see it.
Our next question from our audience is from Zach, and he references, I think, something that Andrew spoke about a little bit earlier tonight. What impact would widespread adoption of ranked ballot voting at the state and local level have on the problem of money in government?
I'm sorry, if you could repeat, ranked ballot vote on the influence of money in government. I think that ranked ballot voting, it's, besides money, ranked ballot voting. So we have a primary system that essentially narrows choice for people. You have to select, they have open primaries in Michigan, but when I go to a primary, I'm only allowed to vote for one party. I can't vote for, a independent governor and then vote for a Democratic congressperson. I don't have that choice. So just expanding that choice so that you can vote for more people is going to give give more people a voice in the process. So the more that you open primaries in general, and ranked choice voting just opens it further, where you can say that I prefer this candidate, but if this person can't get elected, then I prefer this candidate, and so on down, so that your voice is still heard, even if the person that you like the best isn't the most likely to get elected. And when that raises the likelihood that the candidate is going to have the support of a larger group. And in terms of money, money is always going to play some role, but if you're less concerned about just the sheer electability, like a Jeb Bush would be somebody who, and I'm saying this without a lot of research, but when Jeb Bush entered the race in 2016, that he actually provided financing to other candidates in the field to try and help to draw down support for any one person to help his electability. He had enough money to give to other candidates so that they would draw away other people, and he would just be, the tallest midget, as they say, and that he would get elected because of that. And I think that the influence of money, or the influence of radicalism, if not to get too far away because it's not money related, but if you can appeal to any small 20% group within the party and rely on that base you can get elected, but if you're trying to appeal to a wider group of people, then it's going to be harder. Ranked choice makes it so that you're able to do that more easily, and it will to some extent decrease the influence of money. But I can't give you a statistic on what that's going to be.
Yeah, I also don't think there's a real direct link between ranked choice voting and money in politics. I think there's a sort of an indirect link that ranked choice voting certainly makes it easier for third parties and independents to get fair consideration because it eliminates the spoiler effect. So that argument that you shouldn't consider voting for a Green Party candidate or an independent or a libertarian because that's only going to help your least favorite candidate get elected, that goes away with the ranked choice ballot. So in some senses, it might erode some of the power of the parties. And if you think of the parties as I do, as nothing more than aggregation points for special interests, then there is a little bit of an indirect impact on money in politics. I think the real advantages of ranked choice voting are, number one, think about politics the way you would think about any industry. As long as there's limited competition, invariably there is a limited need to satisfy customers. And I don't think we can think of an industry where customer satisfaction is lower than what we're seeing in Congress today. If ranked choice voting enabled additional parties and or independents to be more successful, created more competition, ultimately, I think it makes our electoral system more responsive to the needs of voters. So that's the first thing. Second thing is ranked choice voting, as Andrew said, really allows you to express your true policy preferences. So if you're a Green Party person, if the environment is by far your number one issue, you may be afraid to vote for the Green Party candidate because you think doing so might help elect, let's say, a conservative Republican who is on the other side of that issue. So you vote for the Democrat. In a ranked choice system, you could vote for the Green Party candidate, or if you're a libertarian, vote for the libertarian, and then name one of the major party candidates as your second choice. The net result of that might be that your candidate doesn't win, but that your preference between the Democrat and the Republican ends up getting elected, knowing that a significant portion of their support came from second choice votes from the Green Party candidate. And knowing that, they're going to be much more in tune with your policy preferences because they realize the margin of victory for them was those second choice votes. So I think while I don't think there's a direct connection between ranked choice voting and money in politics, I do believe there are some really significant advantages. And then the third one I would say is, to the extent we do have a credible third force in our politics, it really dilutes the value of negative advertising. It's half as valuable because now you have to run twice as much of it to attack both credible candidates. And you might come to conclude that maybe it's in my best interest, instead of attacking these other two candidates, to simply put out a positive vision for myself, a positive ad for why you should vote for me, what I care about, what I'm going to do when I'm elected, as opposed to tearing someone else down. So I think it'll have a positive effect on our political culture.
And anything that's going to infuse more excitement in this idea that my vote still counts, that just because, I vote for one person doesn't mean I'm out of the game. I don't have to pick a winner, and then if I put it all on one winner, I'm out. But that you take more time to understand the candidates and the nuances of their issues. I think all of that speaks to a more informed polity, and in theory should allow for greater involvement. Too many times people just think that, well, that candidate's going to win, so who cares if I vote? Who cares if I'm involved? And if we can negate that and again increase greater participation, I think we ultimately win as a system.
Well, we've run out of time tonight, but I want to thank Andrew and Mary and Greg for an entertaining and very educational program. Lots of great insights. Thanks to the three of you very much for joining us tonight.
Happy to be here.
Thank you, Bill.
Thanks, Bill. Mary,
And
Greg,
thank
and
you
Mark.
very much. Yeah, to our audience for viewing. You may want to check your TV listings to see when Unrepresented is going to be appearing, or look at the website of your local PBS TV station so you can do so. But we would recommend it as a very important documentary for all Americans to see. Hopefully you can join us next week when we'll talk to Bob Blameyer about his book on Indiana Senator Birch Bayh. Thanks for joining us tonight, and have a great evening.
Thank you for joining the Dole Institute of Politics for our program this evening. If you are a student and would like to join the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. Next week, we look forward to hosting Robert Blameyer on Tuesday, March 23rd at 7 p.m. for a discussion of his book, Birch Bayh, Making a Difference. You can access this program on the Dole Institute's YouTube channel, just like tonight's program. Refer to doleinstitute.org for up-to-date information on all of our upcoming programs. We hope you enjoy this evening's program. Thank you and good night.